The desert does not forgive silence. When Ethan Miller and his pregnant wife Rachel set up camp in the sunburnt wilderness of Joshua Tree National Park, they told their families they'd be back within 2 days. Their car was packed with supplies, their tent new and carefully chosen, and their excitement reflected in every message they sent before heading into the sprawling Mojave. But when 2 days stretched into 3, then 5, with no call, no text, and no sign of return, what began as a routine camping trip hardened into a mystery. Ethan and Rachel had vanished into the park's vast expanse, their absence echoing louder than any cry for help. Joshua Tree is a place that does not yield answers easily. It sprawls across nearly 800,000 acres of desert-serrated rock formations, twisted yucca trees, and a silence that seems older than time. Its beauty draws millions every year, but beneath that beauty lies indifference. Temperatures that soar past 100 by day plummet into bitter cold at night. Dehydration can set in within hours, disorientation in minutes. For a couple carrying not just themselves, but the fragile promise of a child, the stakes were higher than anyone knew. The first calls came from family. At first, it was a gentle concern. Had they lingered for one more sunset, stretched the trip to savor the stillness? But as hours ticked into days with no word, concern turned to alarm. Friends drove the highways leading into the park, scanning every turnout and every trailhead, hoping for a glimpse of their vehicle. It was not there. Only when rangers were notified did the search take its first step into the desert. The logbook at the visitors' center showed their names scrawled neatly under a date and time. They had entered, but they had not come out. The search was immediate, but the desert is vast and the window small. Helicopters beat the air above the canyons, their infrared sensors probing the shadows of boulders and the narrow crevices where a body might lie unseen. Ground teams followed faint tracks, boot imprints fading in the dust, but each trail ended in nothing. Scattered sand erased more efficiently than any suspect. Days passed. The campgrounds they might have chosen remained empty. Their supplies were nowhere to be found. The desert gave no sign that Ethan and Rachel, one of them carrying life within her, had ever passed through. Investigators began to piece together the context. Ethan was steady, practical, and fond of meticulous planning. He had researched routes, chosen equipment, and even accounted for the risk of rattlesnakes and scarce water. Rachel, several months pregnant, had been hesitant but supportive, hoping the trip would be a memory preserved before their lives changed forever. There was no sign of conflict, no hint that either had intended not to return. What emerged instead was the profile of two people looking forward, planning not an escape, but a future, which made their disappearance all the more incomprehensible. The early theory centered on the desert itself. Heat exhaustion, a wrong turn, a sudden fall into one of the hidden gullies that thread between rock formations like scars. The desert was unforgiving, and many who underestimated it never walked out again. But the scale of the search effort seemed to defy those explanations. How could two people, carrying visible gear, vanish so completely? Why had not a single water bottle, scrap of clothing, or trace of camp been uncovered? Then came the vehicle. Nearly a week into the search, a ranger spotted it at a remote trailhead, dust-coated, locked, but otherwise untouched. Inside were the couple's remaining supplies: food, water, and a roadmap annotated with neat handwriting. The discovery shifted the investigation sharply. If they had parked here, they would have chosen a path, but no one could agree on which one. The surrounding terrain was a maze of boulder fields and faint trails, paths that seemed to promise passage but ended abruptly in sheer rock faces. Search teams traced them methodically, sometimes within shouting distance of one another, yet the desert yielded nothing. For every hour that passed, the chances of survival shrank. Family members gathered at the command post set up near the park's entrance, clinging to updates. Some prayed aloud. Others stood in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if the desert itself might finally release the two figures they longed to see walking out of the heat shimmer. Rangers offered reassurances, but beneath their professional tone lay unease. Every missing person leaves a trace. Here, there was none. By the 10th day, the official operation scaled back. Rangers cited the brutal heat, the exhaustion of personnel, and the statistical unlikelihood of recovery. The families protested, voices sharp against the still air, but the desert had spoken in its usual language, silence. The official record now listed Ethan and Rachel Miller as missing, presumed lost to the wilderness. It was the neatest explanation, but for those who knew them, it was not enough. Because the desert may take lives, but it does not take them without evidence. And in Joshua Tree, silence often hides not just the indifference of nature, but the shadow of something else entirely. The discovery of the vehicle was both a relief and a riddle. For searchers, it was the first concrete anchor in an otherwise drifting investigation. Ethan and Rachel Miller had entered Joshua Tree. They had parked here, at this particular trailhead. Beyond that, the landscape opened into silence and uncertainty. The car itself offered no signs of struggle. The doors were locked, the tires were intact, and the keys were gone, suggesting they had walked away willingly. Inside, investigators found carefully organized supplies. Extra food, bottled water, and Rachel's prenatal vitamins were neatly stowed in the glove compartment. A trail map sat on the passenger seat, its paper curled slightly from the dry desert heat. Several routes had been circled in pen, with faint notes scribbled in Ethan's precise handwriting. Ridge overlook, sunset view, caves. There was no sign of panic, no hurried departure. Everything suggested intention. They had parked. They had chosen a path. Then, they had vanished. The terrain surrounding the trailhead was not the wide, well-trodden expanse tourists favored. This was a quieter section of the park, where faint trails bled into rock and shrubs erased footprints within minutes. To the south, a jagged ridge rose like a saw blade against the sky. To the north stretched a labyrinth of boulder piles, formations so complex they seemed designed to confuse. And to the west, canyons cut deep scars into the desert floor, their shadows swallowing anything that entered after dusk. Ground teams fanned out in concentric circles from the vehicle. They followed washes, climbed ridges, and scanned the boulders for signs of movement. Helicopters swept overhead, their infrared sensors glowing in the darkness as they probed for heat signatures. But every pass ended the same. The desert remained silent, the screens blank. Family members who had rushed to the site clung to hope. Ethan's sister insisted he would never take Rachel on a route too dangerous, not with her pregnancy. Rachel's parents reminded investigators that she had been meticulous about her health, determined to protect not just herself, but the unborn child. They wouldn't have wandered recklessly. Something had happened, something deliberate. Theories began to spiral. The simplest explanation? Heat and exhaustion remained possible, but investigators struggled with the absence of evidence. Even in tragedies, the desert usually left clues. Discarded packs, clothing caught on rock, and footprints stretching toward futility. Here, nothing. As one ranger noted quietly at the command center, it was as if the desert had conspired to erase them. Attention turned to the notes on Ethan's map. The phrase, "ridge overlook," suggested they might have sought a vantage point. Search teams climbed each rise in the vicinity, scanning the gullies below. Nothing. The circled word caves sparked interest as well. Joshua Tree holds countless hidden pockets in its rock formations, some large enough to shelter a person, others deadly traps that collapse without warning. Teams probed likely sites, their headlamps stabbing into darkness. They found only dry sand, dust, and silence. By the end of the second week, whispers of alternative explanations began to circulate. Joshua Tree has long carried a reputation as a place where disappearances aren't always natural. Its remoteness has attracted more than hikers. Survivalists, drifters, and those wishing to disappear from the world are drawn to its emptiness. In the early days of the search, investigators noted several unpermitted camps in the region. None were directly tied to the Millers' disappearance, but the knowledge added a layer of unease. If Ethan and Rachel had encountered the wrong person in the wrong place, the desert would conceal the truth as effectively as it erased tracks. Yet there was no evidence of confrontation. No vehicle tracks suggesting pursuit, no abandoned items indicating a sudden flight. Forensic technicians dusted the Millers' car and examined the campsite. No foreign fingerprints, no forced entry. Nothing to indicate anyone else had been near the vehicle. Then came the first fragment of discovery. Nearly 3 miles from the trailhead, a searcher spotted fabric tangled in the brittle branches of a creosote bush. It was pale, almost bleached by the sun, and for a moment it seemed insignificant, just another piece of litter scattered by the wind. But when examined closely, it revealed itself to be a strip of cotton, patterned faintly in soft blue. Rachel's family confirmed she had been wearing a light maternity blouse, pale blue with delicate patterns along the sleeves. The fabric matched. The bush stood near the entrance to a narrow canyon. Search teams poured into the slot, their voices echoing against the high stone walls. They found no further traces, but the fabric shifted the focus dramatically. If Rachel's blouse had torn here, then they had passed this way. But had they continued deeper, or had the desert swallowed them within those walls? The canyon twisted for nearly a mile, before collapsing into impassable boulders. Teams scoured every alcove, every shadow. They found nothing. The discovery of the fabric deepened the mystery, rather than solving it. If the couple had passed here, where had they gone? The search extended into its third week. Supplies at the command post dwindled. Volunteers who had once flooded the site trickled home. The desert's heat remained unrelenting, the ground shimmering under each midday sun. Rangers pressed on, but their reports grew thinner. The optimism drained from their voices. The official narrative began to form. The Millers had likely succumbed to the elements. Their bodies would remain hidden in the vast expanse, perhaps forever. But not everyone accepted that explanation. Rachel's mother stood at the trailhead where the car was found, staring into the horizon. "My daughter didn't just vanish," she whispered to a ranger who stood beside her. "Something happened here. Something we're not being told." Those words lingered. Because sometimes in Joshua Tree, the desert's silence is not just nature's indifference. Sometimes it is the echo of something darker, hidden just beyond the reach of daylight. The week the fabric was found, the search changed texture. It went from wide sweeps to tight circles, from miles of trail to inches of sandstone where a thread could snag and tell a story. The strip of pale blue didn't just suggest passage. It suggested contact, cloth against rock, a moment where the body moved close enough to brush, close enough for the desert to take something and keep it. Because of that, teams returned to the canyon in quiet, deliberate lines. They moved with the precision of forensics and the restraint of reverence, as if the stone might speak if given the chance. In the slot, the temperature shifted 10 degrees from sun to shade. Voices flattened into the walls and returned as a dull hum. Dust kicked up by boots hung in beams of light like smoke. Trackers studied the ground for disturbances in the thin crust of caliche, for the faint, scalloped marks of trail shoes. Here and there, the surface told a story, and then erased itself a foot away. A scuff? A crescent? Nothing. A cadaver dog alerted once where the floor pinched near a pour-off. Searchers lowered themselves into a shallow bowl, polished by seasonal floods. Under a lip of rock, they found a small elastic band, snapped and brittle from the heat. The color, once bright, had faded to a chalky rose. Rachel's mother recognized the type immediately. Rachel wore them constantly to bundle her hair when the wind picked up. The band was placed into a paper evidence envelope. Under a microscope later that day, a single hair was teased from the fibers, the root intact. The DNA matched the toothbrush from the Miller's home. It was proof. cruel and undeniable. She had been here, above this pour-off, near this bowl, beneath this lip. But proof of presence did not resolve direction. The canyon split into 3 short fingers. One dead-ended at a wall scored with water lines like growth rings. Another twisted into a blind chamber. The third opened, briefly, onto a chamber where light pooled. It was here a searcher saw the faintest suggestion of parallel lines in the dust, a few inches apart, repeating. He knelt and traced them with a gloved finger. The lines were too regular for animal tracks and too close for normal walking. Someone had scooted or slid. But how far? Beyond that chamber, the floor hardened into stone again, and the story stopped. False leads bloomed like mirages. A smudged handprint high on a boulder turned out to be desert varnish, oil black and ancient. A flash of metal in a crevice revealed itself as a rusted tent stake, abandoned by another crew years prior. At one unpermitted camp a mile from the slot, a ring of rocks encircled a bed of ash still holding a few fresh embers. The surrounding footprints were numerous, chaotic and poorly preserved, as if a group had come and gone in a hurry. Stacked inside a nylon duffel were empty cans of a high-caffeine drink and a damaged cookpot, its aluminum bottom scorched to soot. The cans were recent. The manufacturing code was still legible. For a day, attention swung hard in that direction until a pair of climbers came forward, sheepish and apologetic, admitting they'd camped illegally to dodge fees and avoid the crowds. Receipts and photos placed them in the area at the right time. The camp belonged to them. The narrative snapped back. Investigators turned to the park's thin net of surveillance. There aren't many cameras in a desert this large, but the few that exist, traffic counters near entrances, license plate readers at certain choke points, can provide a time-locked skeleton of movement. Records showed the Miller's SUV entering at 6:48 a.m. on the morning in question. No corresponding exit was recorded. A second camera on a service road that could have served as an alternate exit reported downtime that same afternoon due to maintenance. Logs confirmed a contractor had signed in to work the unit. An invoice matched the date. The coincidence felt pointed and too neat, and for 48 hours suspicion circled it. But interviews and location data lifted the suspicion like a sheet from a table. It had been an unglamorous failure, a camera with a dead battery, and a technician who spent the afternoon swapping parts in a heat shimmer. The story retreated into stone again. Midway through the 4th week, a spotter in a helicopter saw a hard glint in a boulder field west of the canyon. With the aircraft hovering, a team scrambled on the ground, picking their way through stacked granite like chess pieces tumbled mid-game. At the base of a narrow fissure, lodged between 2 rocks, they found a rectangular plate of scratched black plastic attached to a short tether. It was a portable solar charger, dust-caked and sun-bleached on one side, clean where it had rested against rock on the other. A faded sticker peeled at one corner. When wiped, a faint silver E stood out, the remainder of a name tag. At home, Ethan used a label maker on everything he took outdoors. The serial number traced to a purchase on a card registered to the couple. The panel was small, designed to sit beside a pack while hiking or on a rock during a break. It suggested even deeper intention. They expected to be out long enough to top up a battery. Technicians examined the panel. Tiny gouges patterned the edges where it had knocked against stone. One corner bore a smear of something faintly greasy and tan. Under a reagent, it fluoresced the way sunscreen sometimes does. It could have been skin oil or dust mixed with residue, or just the desert tattooing the object it borrowed. The fissure beside the panel was narrow enough to swallow a small backpack. Rescuers shone lights down. The beam lost itself after 30 feet, where the crack veered. It smelled faintly of rodent. A fiber optic camera, threaded down, showed only more rock. No fabric, no metal, no bone. The panel made sense and refused to at once, a contradiction the rock enjoyed. The emptiness began to press on family gatherings at the command tent. People talked less, but with more intensity. Maps replaced conversation. At night, wind pulled at tent walls, making nylon breathe. In the mornings, a line of vehicles formed, dust pluming behind them as crews headed out to repeat what they'd done the day before. Because sometimes the second pass reveals what the first couldn't see. An investigator from the coroner's office, experienced in outdoor recovery but not usually part of the field search, requested data from meteorological stations sprinkled across the park. He was looking for anomalies, a spike in wind, a temperature plunge that might have contributed to a decision, like leaving a trail to seek shade. The record showed the day had been unremarkable in its brutality. An early ramp to triple digits, a late afternoon lull, and a night that cooled but never cooled enough. That report merely added weight to the most mundane hypothesis. Heat had forced a choice. The choice had doubled back on itself. The stone had closed over the mistake. And yet the strip of blouse, the hair tie, and the charger were all clustered along a line that pointed west of the trailhead, not south or north. The line intersected a patch of terrain that had been overlooked in the earliest passes. A field of low domes, split by seams, punctuated by shallow tanajas, natural rock basins that hold water long after rain. Tanajas attract animals. Animals attract cameras. Quietly, the park maintains a handful of camera traps near known basins to study wildlife movement. Most of the units are set to trigger at night to preserve battery life and reduce storage needs. If anything could be recorded without being noticed, it would be one of these. In late August, a hydrology tech collected an SD card from a camera hidden under a stony overhang. Its lens pointed at a polished basin the size of a backyard kiddie pool. The card had not been checked since early spring. Back at his desk, he clicked through months of night scenes. Coyotes, a bobcat, kangaroo rats in silver arcs of freeze-frame motion, and the flicker of moths near the infrared illuminator. The tech's mouse paused over a frame stamped with a date in the middle of the miller's disappearance. Two figures moved across the lower third of the image, not animals but people, ghost bright in infrared. One was taller and moved with a cautious forward tilt, as if burdened. The other was smaller, a step back, with one hand extended, fingers splayed for balance. The taller figure carried something in the other hand, metallic enough to reflect infrared as a pale streak. The water reflected them in a broken, still pool. In the next frame, the two were at the basin's edge. The smaller figure leaned toward the water, cupping a hand. The taller figure kept watch, head turned to the dark. A third frame showed an object placed near the lip of the tanaja, square and black. The fourth frame was empty. The sequence lasted less than 10 seconds in that slow, mechanical rhythm of trail cameras. The stamp at the bottom right fixed the moment. The coordinates listed in the camera records placed the basin a mile and a half west of the slot. When the tech zoomed in on the taller figure's torso, he saw a subtle, rounded protrusion at the abdomen that shifted the silhouette forward. Not a pack, not gear, something else. He forwarded the images to the incident command. The search didn't have heat signatures. It had ghosts. But in ghost light, sometimes the truth is brighter because it has fewer places to hide. The images from the wildlife camera circulated through the command tent like contraband, passed hand to hand, stared at in silence. The grain was coarse, the figures spectral, but the implication was devastatingly clear. It was them, Ethan and Rachel Miller, alive at that moment, standing at the basin in ghostlight, Rachel's silhouette unmistakably altered by the pregnancy she carried. For the first time in weeks, the story had something solid, a timestamp, a location, a confirmation that they had made it further than the canyon where the fabric and charger were found. Investigators recalibrated the search around that basin, a point on the map that suddenly burned brighter than the rest. Teams deployed in expanding arcs, scouring the low domes, peering into every tanaja, and probing every fissure. Cadaver dogs were lifted in by helicopter, their paws touching down on rock hot enough to scorch in minutes. They worked in shifts, noses to the wind, handlers whispering encouragement. Helicopters flew low, rattling the air over the basin, cameras slung beneath them like eyes that never blinked. The water in the tinaja itself was tested. No trace of chemical contamination, no unusual mineral content, and no foreign fibers. Just water, cool beneath the surface film. A mirror that had reflected their faces one night before swallowing them back into mystery. The surrounding ground yielded no camp remains. No wrappers, no fire ring, no impression of a sleeping pad pressed into sand. If they had rested here, they would have left nothing behind. That in itself was telling. People under duress often shed items, discard weight, and leave markers of desperation. Here, nothing. It suggested deliberation. They weren't collapsing yet. They were moving. For days, the search pulsed outward from the basin. Teams rappelled into narrow fissures where owls startled from the dark, wings brushing stone like cloth. Probes descended into waterholes to test for human DNA in the sediment. Drones with thermal cameras skimmed the horizon at night, their monitors glowing with the false color of radiant heat. And yet, again, nothing. The desert, it seemed, had swallowed its secret whole. Then, in the second week after the images surfaced, a ranger on foot patrol stumbled upon a curious pattern in a sandy wash a mile north of the basin. At first glance, it looked like erosion parallel grooves pressed into fine sand. But the grooves continued further than any animal drag would. They crossed the wash, curved toward a low rise, and disappeared onto slick rock. The ranger marked the site, and analysts later determined the spacing and depth were consistent with a lightweight object dragged behind a person. The obvious candidate was the solar charger, tether scraping as they walked. Forensic mapping placed the grooves on a trajectory that skirted north of the basin, toward a line of weather-beaten Joshua trees silhouetted against a ridge. That ridge, known to locals as Dead Horse Point, was notorious for hidden drop-offs and sudden shifts in terrain. If the Millers had pressed in that direction, their odds would have plummeted. But if they had, why? The ridge wasn't on their planned route. It wasn't even on the alternative trails. Searchers had to consider the psychology of the lost. People don't always move rationally in a crisis. They chase shade, chase water, and chase horizon lines that feel like exits. They follow the angle of the sun or the slope of the land without realizing where it leads. And sometimes, they are led by things investigators cannot account for. On the third sweep near the ridge, a volunteer paused at a shallow alcove under an overhang. The air inside was cooler, heavy with dust. There, pressed into the wall as if someone had leaned against it, was the faint outline of a handprint. Not a fossilized mark, but a smear in the fine coating of desert dust. When photographed with raking light, the print showed ridges and valleys, the ghost of fingerprints. But time had blurred it beyond comparison. Beside the print lay a fragment of fabric, threadbare, the color drained by the sun until it was impossible to tell if it had once been pink or beige or something else entirely. The fragment was sealed and tested. No DNA, just dust and fiber. But its presence was another whisper in the same direction. By this point, the family's hope lived in small increments. Each discovery was not a promise of life, but a proof of passage, another stone on the cairn of loss. Rachel's mother clutched the wildlife photos constantly, the only evidence that her daughter had been alive days after she was last heard. She traced the faint swell of the silhouette in the infrared glow, whispering the name of the grandchild who would never be born. Investigators shifted their attention again, widening the scope to include possibilities they had resisted earlier. Human intervention. Encounters in the backcountry are rare but not impossible. The desert shelters, drifters, hermits, and prospectors. In the summer months, it also draws illegal growers and traffickers who use remote canyons as cover. A theory began to circulate. What if the Millers had stumbled upon someone who did not want to be found? The theory gathered momentum when a pair of hikers reported something unusual. They had been traversing a seldom-used trail 5 miles from the basin when they discovered a makeshift cache, 3 empty fuel canisters, a coil of nylon rope, and a camouflaged tarp rolled tight. The items were recent, not sun-bleached. Law enforcement descended, combing the area. They found boot prints, larger than Ethan's known shoe size, oriented in patterns that suggested surveillance. And yet, as quickly as suspicion flared, it guttered. The items were traced to a group of climbers who had stashed gear months earlier for a project they abandoned. The prints matched their boots. Another false lead, another collapse of certainty. The search was now in its second month. Funding strained, volunteers thinned. Heat drove daytime operations into dawn and dusk windows, shrinking the hours when crews could move safely. Families begged for persistence, but whispers of suspension began to circulate. Then, one morning, a sheriff's deputy reviewing old case logs noticed an entry that had been dismissed early. On the night the Millers were last photographed at the basin, a resident on the park's northern boundary had reported seeing a light moving strangely across the ridge. At the time, it was written off as hikers or a stray off-road vehicle, but the timestamp matched within an hour of the wildlife images. If the report was accurate, the Millers had not just lingered at the basin. They had moved north, onto the ridge, carrying a light. The report was re-examined. The resident, an older man with decades living on the edge of the desert, described the light as not steady, like it swung side to side. To him, it looked like someone carrying a lantern, though he knew no one used lanterns anymore. More likely, it was a flashlight, weak or improvised, carried in a trembling hand. The detail was chilling. A weak light suggested failing batteries or exhaustion. Swinging suggested instability. That night, somewhere between the wildlife camera and the ridge, the Millers had moved through the dark, carrying a faltering glow. The question was, what waited for them when the light died? The northern ridge had always been a place of broken maps. Trails ended there. Lines on paper stopped against a contour of stone, but in reality, the terrain kept going, splitting into knife-edged gullies and vertical chimneys where heat pooled like smoke. For the Millers to have climbed into that expanse with a weak light was almost a guarantee of disaster. Search teams began an exhaustive sweep of Dead Horse Point, their boots scraping through loose scree that skittered down unseen slopes. Helicopters hovered, rotors slashing the silence, their searchlights bleaching the stone into ghost-white cones. But the ridge resisted them. Its fractures ran deeper than radar could penetrate. Its ledges overhung enough to hide entire rooms of shadow. On the third day of the ridge search, a team found something lodged in a thorny ocotillo. A strip of nylon, frayed, its stitching sun-baked but still recognizable as belonging to a backpack strap. The length matched the brand of pack Ethan had been carrying, noted from photos before the trip. But here, suspended as if it had been torn free, it was a solitary artifact, detached from any larger story. Investigators marked it, logged it, and pressed on. Hours later, another team, rappelling into a narrow slot off the ridge, struck something harder than sandstone. Their rope dangled into darkness, headlamps flaring on a metallic surface. When they descended, they found an old barrel, rusted through, half collapsed into the sediment. Inside, nothing but dried silt and a scorpion curled in the hollow. Useless, except for what it implied. People had been here before. Not hikers, but prospectors, smugglers, and those who left caches in the desert for reasons never written down. The Canyonlands had a history of such ghosts, and perhaps the Millers had collided with that history. Back at the command tent, maps were laid out, red lines drawn to show search grids, and black lines to show canyons cleared. Every new discovery was pinned to the board: the nylon strap, the basin images, and the light reported from the ridge. Together they formed a constellation that pointed north, further from safety, deeper into wilderness. The theory solidified. After leaving the basin, the Millers veered north, perhaps seeking a way out, perhaps chasing the illusion of a shortcut. They carried a failing light. They left no camp. Something happened on that ridge. But what? Pressure mounted to bring in cadaver dogs again, this time lowered by harness into ravines where human searchers couldn't descend. The dogs barked furiously at one such drop, a chasm whose walls were streaked with mineral stains. Investigators peered down, their lights stabbing into blackness, but the angle concealed the bottom. The logistics of a descent were staggering: unstable rock, no anchors, and risk of collapse. Plans were made, ropes tested, and on the morning of the scheduled descent, a storm rolled over the ridge. Rain hammered the desert. Flash floods carved new wounds into the earth, and the chasm filled with water that churned like black glass. The descent was postponed, then canceled. By the time the flood subsided, the bottom was buried in silt. Whatever secret it held was sealed away. Families broke that day. Rachel's mother collapsed in the tent, whispering that she knew her daughter was down there, and knew the storm had erased her. Ethan's brother slammed his fist into the command board, scattering pins. Officials stood in silence, unable to contradict grief. And still, no bodies, no proof. The search dragged into its third month. Funding cuts loomed. Media coverage shrank from national headlines to local columns. The desert, patient and merciless, closed its hands over the story. Then, a break. Not in the desert, but in the lab. A forensic analyst examining the torn nylon strap noticed something peculiar. Along the frayed edge, under magnification, there were traces of an adhesive not used in manufacturing. It was resin-based, the kind often found in industrial glues. More telling, embedded in the resin were tiny flecks of copper wire, finer than human hair. This wasn't just a strap torn by rock. It had been in contact with something man-made, something electrical. Investigators revisited the location. Nothing nearby explained the adhesive or the copper, but the find cracked open a new theory. The Millers hadn't just vanished into rock and heat. They had crossed paths with infrastructure hidden in the desert: equipment, installations, or activity unmarked on any map. Weeks earlier, whispers had circulated about illegal power siphoning in the park, solar rigs hidden to feed operations off the grid. Officials dismissed it as a rumor. Now, the copper flecks in resin brought those whispers back. Had the Millers stumbled onto something human, not natural? To probe deeper, investigators combed satellite archives. Infrared scans from nights around the disappearance showed faint heat blooms in remote zones north of the basin, too small to be camps, too structured to be natural. Analysts enhanced the images. What emerged were rectangular signatures, like panels, hidden solar rigs. The desert's silence had been concealing more than rock. The Millers' trail, once thought random, now aligned chillingly close to those signatures. It was no longer only a search for accident victims. It was a question of whether two campers had walked into a place they were never meant to see. The solar anomalies, once dismissed as distortions, became the pivot of the investigation. Satellite operators traced heat signatures, stretching across the desert like breadcrumbs, small clusters forming geometric shapes no natural formation could replicate. Each cluster suggested equipment panels angled to the sun, cables feeding into something unseen. They were positioned on ridges that offered no hiking appeal, no scenic reward, and places only intentional travelers would ever visit. The theory hardened. Ethan and Rachel Miller had wandered close to one of these installations, their presence noticed, their lives intersecting with a shadow in the desert. A task force was formed. Agents from multiple agencies drove into Joshua Tree in unmarked vehicles, their radios silent, their gear wrapped in canvas to avoid attention. They began sweeping the northern ridge with detectors, searching for electromagnetic traces. The readings spiked at intervals, faint at first, then sharper, until the sensors crackled with interference. They stood before a canyon wall, unremarkable from a distance, but behind the stone lay a cavity, air pushed faintly outward, warmer than the desert air. They breached it with crowbars, stone falling in muffled collapses. Inside was no cavern, but a chamber lined with panels, racks of batteries, and cables snaking like roots. The floor was packed, sand stained by boot prints. Someone had built a concealed power vault inside Joshua Tree, operating without a permit or record. Its purpose was unclear, but its presence was undeniable. And scattered across the floor were traces of cloth and paper. Investigators bagged everything, hauling it under the cover of night. In the lab, they unfolded the scraps. A receipt, half rotted, its ink blurred by moisture, but still legible enough to reveal the date, July 6th, 2 days after Ethan and Rachel were last seen. On the back, someone had written initials in pen, R.M. The handwriting was unsteady, with letters leaning into each other, but the coincidence was too precise to ignore. Theories ignited. Had Rachel, exhausted and disoriented, written her initials on the scrap? Had she been alive in that chamber, held, or hidden? Or had someone else marked it, mocking, planting a false trail? The chamber opened a darker avenue. Human interference. Rangers recalled whispers of illegal mining operations decades earlier, shafts abandoned after seizures. But locals still told stories of reactivation, men in trucks driving at night, and convoys vanishing into canyons. If the Millers had stumbled onto such an operation, their fate may not have been an accident. The media caught the leak. Headlines screamed of secret desert facilities and Joshua Tree conspiracy. Families protested the speculation, demanding focus remain on finding bodies, not chasing stories. But the narrative had shifted, and every new discovery twisted the tension tighter. 3 weeks later, a patrol stumbled across another artifact 10 miles north, a torn page from a spiral notebook lodged under a rock ledge. On it, a single line written in black ink: "Heat is worse at night." Investigators compared the handwriting to samples from Rachel's journal at home. Forensic experts concluded a high probability match. She had written it, which meant she survived long enough to document her suffering, days or perhaps weeks into the disappearance. The phrase itself puzzled them. Heat is worse at night. In the desert, nights were cold. But inside the power chamber, with racks of batteries exhaling warmth, the heat could have been oppressive. Rachel had been there. The page was her testimony. At the family's request, search teams intensified operations near the solar anomalies. But each sweep revealed more layers of concealment. Shallow pits where equipment had been buried, tarps weighted with stones, and footprints obliterated by scouring winds. Whoever had built those sites had dismantled them quickly, erasing presence, leaving behind only fragments. Still, the fragments told a story. Copper dust on the strap, resin traces, initials on a receipt, handwriting on a notebook page. Together they painted a picture not of collapse or accident, but of captivity. Ethan and Rachel Miller had vanished into Joshua Tree, but the desert's silence was not absolute. It whispered in ink and nylon, in copper flecks and torn pages, and those whispers suggested their disappearance was orchestrated by human hands. The case no longer resembled a search for hikers. It resembled a cover-up. Families were briefed, their faces hollow with disbelief. Rachel's sister whispered that she had known all along. Her sister would never vanish quietly into stone, not without leaving something behind. Ethan's father demanded names, and demanded to know who was being protected. Officials offered none. But behind closed doors, investigators were charting connections. Equipment purchased under shell companies, shipments routed through border towns, and contracts that looped into corporations with no offices. Each thread led deeper into a web, where the desert was only the staging ground, not the route. And somewhere in that web, Ethan and Rachel had become collateral. The ridge, once a place of broken maps, had revealed more than stone. It had revealed a fracture in the story itself, a fault line where truth and deception twisted together. The search was no longer for footprints in sand. It was for proof of human shadows cast across Joshua Tree's silence. The discovery of Rachel Miller's handwriting ignited the investigation with a new urgency. Up until then, officials could placate the public with theories of disorientation, dehydration, or tragic accident. But the note shattered that narrative. It proved survival beyond the first days. It proved confinement, and it implied a witness. The search perimeter expanded dramatically. Helicopters flew low over remote mesas, their shadows skating across the sandstone, while tactical teams probed abandoned ranch shacks and mine shafts long collapsed. Each new dig was a gamble with time, a question of whether the earth would yield its secret or tighten its silence. Amid this intensification, a ranger named Torres uncovered something overlooked in the early days of the search. He had been reviewing archived patrol logs, cross-referencing vehicle sightings around the time the Millers disappeared. One entry stood out. A black pickup, with its plates obscured, parked illegally near a disused service road that led into the heart of the northern ridges. The timestamp was 10:47 p.m., just one day after Ethan and Rachel were last seen. The ranger who logged it assumed it was campers trespassing and moved on. But when the report resurfaced, it took on chilling significance. If the Millers had been alive then, the vehicle might have belonged to whoever had them or whoever wanted them hidden. Teams retraced the route. The service road, rutted and narrow, snaked into the desert and terminated near a collapsed quarry. Its floor was a bowl of rubble, silent except for wind scraping across the stone. But on closer inspection, forensic officers detected impressions in the rock, shallow but deliberate. Tires had once rolled here, and more than once, the quarry, though abandoned, had been a staging ground. Evidence collection began. Drone sweeps mapped the area, and infrared cameras probed for disturbances in the soil. At the quarry's edge, half buried beneath scree, they found a metallic fragment. Cleaned in the lab, it proved to be part of a lock mechanism, industrial grade, scarred by force, as if pried open or torn apart under pressure. Theories spiraled. Had Ethan and Rachel been held here, restrained in some kind of container? The fragment suggested confinement, but its purpose remained elusive. Weeks passed, investigators consumed by debris and whispers, until a break came not from the desert, but from the sky. An analyst at a private aerospace firm, reviewing archived satellite images for unrelated mapping, noticed subtle disturbances in the desert floor near the quarry. The disturbances were faint linear patterns, radiating outward, too precise to be natural. They suggested repeated dragging. Something heavy had been moved, hauled across sand, then buried. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. The equipment pulsed into the earth, mapping densities. Beneath 6 feet of sand, readings confirmed voids long, narrow, and metallic. The shapes were consistent with storage containers. Excavation commenced under secrecy. The desert night lit by floodlights. The machines dug cautiously, each scoop revealing hints of rust. Finally, steel edges emerged, corroded and silent. Containers, 2 of them, stacked end to end, their surfaces scarred by time. The first container was breached with bolt cutters. Inside was nothing but sand and insects, the emptiness itself unsettling. But the second container held more. Investigators peered in, their flashlights sweeping over shredded cloth, splintered wood, and stains too dark to dismiss. The forensic unit cataloged each piece. Among the debris, they found a sandal strap, frayed and weathered, but still recognizable as belonging to Rachel. And wedged in the corner, crushed flat by weight, lay a disposable water bottle. Its plastic label, though half-peeled, bore fingerprints. They ran the prints. The results were conclusive. They belonged to Ethan Miller. The desert had finally spoken, and what it said was undeniable. The Millers had been inside the containers. They had been confined, transported, and hidden. And whatever befell them had not been the work of chance or nature. Families were notified. The meeting was held in a sterile government room, fluorescent lights buzzing above as officials delivered the news. Ethan's brother sat rigid, fists clenched, while Rachel's mother wept openly. They demanded answers: who, why, and when, but answers remained elusive. The evidence pointed to design, not accident, yet the designers remained invisible. The investigation pivoted to motive. Why would anyone conceal two hikers in steel containers? Smuggling? Retaliation? Silence over what they had seen? Every possibility was explored, none complete. Meanwhile, whispers spread among locals. Stories of convoys at night, of men patrolling with rifles, of equipment buried where no one was meant to walk. Old miners recalled rumors of unregistered excavations and prospectors vanishing after trespassing. A pattern emerged, not of isolated tragedy, but of geography haunted by secrecy. For the first time, investigators considered whether the Millers had stumbled not just upon illegal activity, but upon an operation worth killing for. The desert, indifferent and vast, had offered fragments of truth: a page in Rachel's hand, a sandal strap, fingerprints on plastic. Each fragment was small, but together they formed a map. A map not of trails or ridges, but of human decisions made in shadow. The search was no longer for lost hikers. It was for the architects of their disappearance. And as pressure mounted, one detail gnawed at every investigator. If Rachel had written her initials and documented her suffering, when exactly had that note been left behind? Had she written it in despair, knowing the end was near? Or had she written it as proof so that if she vanished, someone would know she had lived, at least for a time, inside the desert's silence? The containers unearthed from the quarry shifted the investigation into a darker, more deliberate arena. They were not accidental tombs, but chosen instruments, proof of premeditation, of control exerted over two ordinary people who had simply ventured into the desert seeking respite. What began as a missing persons search now resembled an excavation of concealed violence, and the weight of that revelation pressed down on every official involved. The forensic teams devoted weeks to combing through the containers. Every flake of rust, every fiber, and every particle of soil was catalogued. Ultraviolet light revealed faint streaks across the inner walls, streaks consistent with human contact fingers dragging against metal in vain. One corner bore a smear that testing confirmed was human blood, degraded but still carrying genetic markers. The sample matched Rachel Miller. Investigators reconstructed a harrowing sequence. Ethan and Rachel had been alive when confined. They had touched the walls, left prints, and fought against the silence. At least for a time, they had endured within steel and shadow. The knowledge hollowed those who studied the evidence. The desert's cruelty was vast enough, but this was cruelty imposed by human hands. Attention turned to the quarry itself. Satellite imagery showed repeated visits to the site in the months following the Millers' disappearance. Trucks, barely visible specks, appeared in images taken at irregular intervals. Someone had returned again and again to monitor or manipulate what was hidden. Who had that access? And why risk returning if the intention was to conceal forever? Detectives widened their lens. Records from the Bureau of Land Management revealed disputes over land leases in the surrounding area. Companies, some legitimate, others shell corporations, had sought access to parcels bordering the quarry. Most were denied, but one name appeared repeatedly, tied to lobbying efforts and shadowy transactions: a development firm that specialized in mineral extraction and off-grid energy projects. The firm's presence in official documents contrasted starkly with its absence on the ground. No offices, no registered employees in the county, only signatures on paperwork and payments wired through distant accounts. The deeper the financial analysts dug, the murkier the trail became. Funds routed through intermediaries, equipment rentals paid in cash, vehicles leased under aliases, the machinery of obfuscation. Meanwhile, whispers among locals grew louder. Retired rangers recounted incidents of being followed at night, headlights lingering in rearview mirrors, or drones hovering silently above their homes. A prospector told investigators of armed men, warning him away from a canyon months before the Millers vanished. He had kept quiet out of fear, but now, faced with news of the containers, he spoke. His account suggested a network of watchers embedded in the desert, guarding something unseen. The possibility emerged that Ethan and Rachel had stumbled across one of these guarded sites, perhaps unknowingly documenting something with their camera. That act, innocuous to them, might have marked them for capture. The public, when informed of the new findings, responded with outrage. Families demanded accountability. Journalists swarmed the desert, broadcasting live from ridgelines and trailheads, framing the region not as a park of solitude, but as a crime scene. Pressure mounted on officials, who in turn pressed investigators to find the link between the firm, the quarry, and the vanished couple. Into this turmoil stepped a forensic linguist, analyzing the short note Rachel had written. The phrasing, spare and uneven, revealed more than despair. Her choice of words, still here, was deliberate. Linguists argued that such phrasing indicated awareness of being monitored, an attempt to leave a breadcrumb rather than a farewell. If correct, Rachel had written not in resignation but in resistance. She wanted her trace found. That interpretation reframed the note as evidence of agency, a defiance that pierced through her circumstances. It gave investigators both renewed drive and a haunting sense of proximity. Rachel had lived long enough to anticipate discovery. She had written herself into the record when those who confined her wanted silence. Attention turned again to the quarry, specifically to the container's manufacture. Serial numbers etched faintly into the steel, though corroded, were traced back to a distributor in Nevada. Purchase records, once buried, were unearthed by subpoenas. They revealed a bulk order, 20 containers bought in cash, registered under a false name. Surveillance footage from the distributor showed only partial images: men loading the containers, their faces obscured by hats, their truck unmarked. But investigators noted a distinctive decal on one vehicle's windshield, a small, circular emblem common to a private security firm operating in the Southwest. That firm, when questioned, denied involvement, but their contracts overlapped with the development company flagged earlier. The circle tightened. All the while, families of the missing couple endured the slow drip of revelation. Each fragment of news brought both clarity and cruelty. Ethan's father kept returning to the trailhead where their car had been found, standing by the empty lot as if proximity might bridge the gap. Rachel's sister held vigils, her candles flickering against desert wind, whispering that Rachel had left them a message for a reason, that someone had to listen. The case teetered between exposure and evasion. For every lead illuminated, shadows multiplied. But what was undeniable was this: Ethan and Rachel Miller had not been lost to the elements. They had been taken, confined, and erased with intention. And those intentions were tied not to random malice but to structure, money, and power embedded within the desert itself. The containers were no longer just evidence. They were monuments of steel coffins testifying to a choice made by unseen hands. And as investigators stared into the rusting walls, they realized the question had shifted. It was no longer only about what had happened. It was about who had the reach to bury people in steel and expect silence from the land itself. The desert had held that silence for years. But now, with Rachel's note and Ethan's fingerprints, the silence had begun to crack, and in those fractures, a far larger truth threatened to emerge. By the time the investigation entered its third year, the desert had transformed from a place of wonder into a stage haunted by absence. Tourists still came to hike the trails, to photograph sunsets that painted the rocks in fire and shadow, but behind the beauty lingered whispers of confinement, steel containers buried beneath sand, and two names spoken like prayers at dusk. Ethan and Rachel Miller were no longer seen as missing hikers. They were symbols of something concealed beneath the surface of the desert itself. Federal agencies escalated their involvement. What had begun as a county missing persons report had swelled into a multi-jurisdictional probe involving the FBI, the Bureau of Land Management, and forensic financial auditors. The containers in the quarry had elevated the case into the realm of organized concealment. Whoever orchestrated their disappearance had not only acted with precision, but also had resources to mask it under the sprawl of wilderness. Investigators retraced every movement the Millers made in the weeks before their disappearance. Credit card transactions, phone records, surveillance from gas stations. They assembled the chronology with painstaking care. The couple's last confirmed purchase was a simple one: water, trail mix, and a paper map at a roadside general store. The cashier, when interviewed years later, recalled Rachel smiling faintly as she adjusted her pack. The ordinary detail contrasted violently with the extraordinary fate that awaited them. Attention shifted once more to the development firm suspected of purchasing the containers. Subpoenas revealed links to offshore accounts and shell companies with ties not just to energy exploration, but to private land acquisitions bordering the national park. It appeared that the desert, far from being untouched wilderness, was contested ground, a landscape where money and secrecy intersected. At the same time, geologists brought in to analyze the quarry site uncovered evidence of more recent disturbance. Soil strata indicated the containers had been buried and then shifted again months later. Someone had returned, perhaps to move, perhaps to retrieve. But why? Had there been more than 2 containers? And if so, what had been inside them? The possibility arose that Ethan and Rachel were not the only ones. Cold case units reviewed disappearances across the Southwest, noting unsettling overlaps. Hikers, wanderers, and even drifters, whose vanishings had been written off as environmental accidents, suddenly seemed aligned with a pattern of concealment. The desert, vast and silent, had long swallowed people whole. But now, investigators wondered, how many had not been swallowed by nature, but by design? Public fear deepened. Documentaries aired, framing the case not as a mystery of loss, but as evidence of human orchestration. Podcasters dissected every scrap of available evidence. Families of other missing persons demanded renewed attention. Joshua Tree's image, once a sanctuary of sky and stone, was fractured by the suspicion that somewhere beneath its beauty lay a grid of hidden tombs. The turning point came from a forensic breakthrough. Analysts examining Rachel's note under scanning electron microscopy detected trace particles embedded in the fibers of the paper. Among them were microscopic flecks of a rare polymer used in industrial insulation. That same polymer was also found in soil samples recovered from the quarry site. The connection was conclusive. Rachel had written her note inside one of the containers unearthed from the desert floor. The discovery clarified the timeline. Rachel had survived long enough inside the container to write the message. Ethan's fingerprints on the inner wall confirmed he had been there too. Together, they had been held. Together, they had vanished into steel. The note was no longer merely a symbol of despair. It was proof of deliberate captivity. Armed with this evidence, investigators secured warrants to search properties linked to the development firm's executives. One property in particular drew attention: a sprawling ranch on the periphery of the park, accessible only by unmarked roads. The search revealed anomalies. Fresh concrete poured over sections of floor in outbuildings, surveillance equipment aimed not outward but inward, and in a locked storage shed, several unused industrial containers, identical in make to those found in the quarry. The shed reeked faintly of chemical disinfectant. Forensic teams swabbed the floors and recovered DNA traces too degraded for immediate identification, but consistent with human presence. The containers bore scratches on their interiors, faint and desperate. The find was devastating. It confirmed that the quarry was not an isolated act, but part of a system, a method of confinement replicated across multiple sites. And it meant Ethan and Rachel were part of a larger architecture of disappearance, one too structured to be the work of chance. For the families, the revelations were unbearable. Ethan's brother described it as discovering that the ground we trusted had teeth. Rachel's mother, when told of the containers in the shed, whispered only, "She was right. She said she was still here." Authorities faced mounting pressure to release a conclusion, to declare a finality, but the truth resisted neat closure. The containers tied to the ranch suggested a vast network of complicity, a machinery that extended beyond a single individual. Executives denied involvement. Employees claimed ignorance. Paper trails dissolved into offshore voids. Meanwhile, investigators weighed whether to declare Ethan and Rachel deceased. Legally, closure could aid the families, allowing them to grieve with certainty. But the existence of unused containers and the unanswered question of why the quarry had been revisited left open the faintest possibility that some captives had been moved, not killed. And among those, perhaps, were the Millers. It was a possibility too slim to anchor hope, yet too real to dismiss. And so the case remained suspended, stretched between proof of confinement and absence of bodies, between the rust of steel and the echo of Rachel's final words. The desert had spoken in fragments. A car abandoned, a note written, fingerprints pressed into metal, containers unearthed like coffins. Yet the whole story refused to surface. What the land concealed, it seemed determined to keep. But the investigators knew this. Silence is never permanent. Steel corrodes, secrets leak, and deserts, though vast, cannot bury truth forever. The Miller's story was not over. It was waiting in the dust, in the rust, in the ground that still held their trace. The case of Ethan and Rachel Miller did not end with a dramatic rescue or a recovered body. It ended as many desert mysteries do, in fragments, in half-revealed truths that leave behind more echoes than answers. But unlike so many other disappearances that fade quietly into unsolved archives, this one carved a permanent scar into the collective memory of everyone who searched, everyone who waited, and everyone who learned to fear what lay beneath the desert floor. By the fourth year of the investigation, the quarry had been sealed off. The industrial containers were removed and stored as evidence in a guarded federal facility. Families of other missing persons visited the site, laying flowers at the edge of the excavation where steel coffins had once lain buried. For them, the Miller's story was not just their tragedy, but a shared reflection of loss, a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be consumed by wilderness and by forces darker than the wilderness itself. Ethan's brother described the desert as a place where the air itself lies. He meant the way silence disguises proximity, how someone could be only yards away and utterly invisible. Rachel's mother, in her quiet, trembling voice, described the discovery of her daughter's note as both salvation and torment. It proved her daughter had lived long enough to write, but it meant she had been alive inside a cage of steel, waiting for a rescue that never came. Forensic analysts continued to test every sample pulled from the containers and the ranch. Trace elements of blood, fragments of fabric fibers, even microscopic hair shafts, each was cataloged, preserved, and analyzed. But degradation, time, and deliberate cleaning meant no definitive identity was ever assigned. To the investigators, the absence of clarity was its own form of cruelty. They had stumbled on the architecture of captivity but could not reconstruct the faces of all who had been confined within it. Still, the containers told their story in other ways. The scratches etched into their walls suggested days of movement, people pressing hands, and fingernails dragging against steel. One container bore faint grooves in the metal floor, almost like pacing. Another showed evidence of repeated contact with flame, as if someone had struck matches or tried to burn scraps of cloth for light. These details painted a picture more visceral than any confession could. Lives lived and lost, inside steel coffins buried under desert soil. The authorities brought charges against executives linked to the development firm. But without bodies, without direct witness testimony, the cases faltered. Attorneys argued the containers were for storage and that DNA traces could not be definitively tied to the Millers. The story threatened to collapse into speculation. Yet the evidence was enough to ensure public outrage, enough to prevent the desert from slipping back into its old silence. To hikers who returned to Joshua Tree, the landscape had changed forever. Each canyon, each expanse of boulders, carried the weight of absence. Tourists asked rangers where the Millers had disappeared, pointing toward the horizon as if the desert itself might answer. Guides whispered warnings of staying on marked trails, but their words carried a heavier implication than dehydration or heat stroke. The Millers' story became a warning cloaked as a legend. Campfire talk in the desert turned their names into symbols of vulnerability, of the thin line between adventure and disappearance. And in that transformation, they lived on. Rachel's note, preserved under glass in an evidence locker, remained the most haunting artifact. "We're still here." The words were stark, aching, and final. They were not just a declaration of survival, but a plea not to be forgotten, not to be erased by shifting sands or indifferent authorities. Ethan's fingerprints, faint and partial, confirmed his presence in the same container. His story, silent and wordless, lived only through the press of skin against steel. He had left no note, no final words, only a trace of touch that endured long after his voice was gone. Together, they created a dual testimony. Her words, his silence. A harmony of despair preserved in steel. In the years that followed, the Millers were officially declared deceased. Legal finality allowed the families to hold memorials to mark the loss with ritual. But those who stood at the podiums and spoke their names knew finality was only an illusion. Questions still circled like vultures overhead. Who orchestrated the containers? Why Joshua Tree? Why them? And beneath all those questions lay the most enduring silence. What exactly happened in the final hours of Ethan and Rachel's lives? The desert kept that silence intact. The quarry, now fenced and patrolled, offered no more secrets. The containers, locked away in sterile evidence vaults, whispered only through scratches and smudges. The land, with its shifting winds and endless horizons, continued as if nothing had ever happened at all. But for those who studied the case, who read Rachel's trembling words and traced Ethan's fingerprints, the truth was clear. Their disappearance was not an accident, not a simple story of hikers lost to sunstroke or dehydration. It was deliberate, structured, and engineered. The desert had been used as a mask, its silence exploited as a cover for something calculated. And so the Millers became more than a missing couple. They became a symbol of the dangers hidden in plain sight. They became a reminder that even in places of beauty, darkness can build its cage. They became proof that absence can echo louder than presence. When the sun sets over Joshua Tree, the rocks glow with fire and shadow, the horizon blurs, and the wind picks up, carrying whispers through the canyons. Some say the land remembers. That in the stillness, if you stand long enough, you can almost hear the words again. We're still here. Their story closes not with resolution, but with resonance. A tragedy carved into silence, an unanswered question pressed into steel, a plea carried endlessly across the desert wind. Ethan and Rachel Miller vanished into Joshua Tree, and though the desert holds them, the truth they left behind ensures they will never disappear. If stories like this one move you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard and remembered, make sure to subscribe. More haunting mysteries and forgotten truths are coming, and you won't want to miss what's revealed next.